I need to say this carefully, because I've spent 4 years now trying to say it at all. My name doesn't matter. What matters is my position and what it required me to do. I was a wildlife conservation officer, a game warden with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, assigned to a territory that covered most of Potter County. If you don't know Potter County, that's normal. 16,000 people spread over 1,000 square miles of the Allegheny Plateau. More deer than residents. More black bear than intersections with traffic lights. The locals call it God's country, and they mean it both ways, beautiful and forsaken. Before you keep listening, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe. This is going to take a while to tell, and the parts that matter don't come until later. I worked out of the Northwest Region office, but my daily reality was my truck, my radio, and about 400 square miles of territory that I patrolled mostly alone. Potter County was one of those assignments the Commission treated as a proving ground. You got it young, you kept it until you either earned a transfer to a district with actual population density, or you decided you preferred the silence. I was in my 6th year when this started. I decided I preferred the silence. My work was law enforcement. I want to be clear about that, because people hear game warden and picture someone in khaki counting fish. I carried a sidearm. I had arrest powers. I investigated poaching, trespassing, illegal dumping on state game lands. And more often than anyone outside the agency would guess, I assisted with search operations when people went missing in the backcountry. Potter County had more state forest land per capita than almost anywhere east of the Mississippi. The Susquehannock State Forest alone covered 265,000 acres, and inside it sat the Hammersley Wild Area, 30,000 acres without a single road. When someone disappeared into that country, Game Commission officers were usually the first ones with boots on the ground, because we already knew the terrain. The fall of 2021 is where I need to begin, though I didn't understand it as a beginning at the time. I understood it as an annoyance. I was working the opening week of archery season, early October. Potter County during archery is mostly about access. Hunters coming in from New York and New Jersey, setting up on leased land or state forest parcels, and occasionally wandering where they shouldn't be. It's not dramatic work. You check licenses, inspect tree stands for safety compliance, answer questions about boundaries. I was doing this on a Tuesday morning along a gated forest road on the northern edge of the Hammersley, about 3 miles south of the village of Cross Fork. My radio was on the Commission's VHF frequency, which in that part of Potter County was marginal at best. The terrain is the problem. The plateau is dissected, meaning it's not flat on top, but carved into deep hollows by streams that have been cutting downward for millions of years. You can be standing at 2,200 feet elevation and have no line of sight to a repeater, because the next ridge over is the same height, and the hollow between you is 400 feet deep and half a mile wide. Radio communication in the Hammersley was a known operational gap. You planned around it. You told dispatch your route before you went in, and you accepted that there would be stretches where no one could reach you and you couldn't reach anyone. That Tuesday morning, I was checking a hunter's license near a pull-off. On McConnell Road, the dirt road that runs along the northern boundary of the wild area, when my radio broke squelch. This was unusual because I'd been getting nothing but static for the previous hour. The signal was clear enough to hear a voice, but not clear enough to make out every word. What I heard was a male voice, calm, with the cadence of someone making a deliberate transmission rather than a casual one. The words I caught were, "On the Nelson branch." And then something I initially heard as, "Need assistance at the..." I keyed the mic and responded. Standard procedure. Commission Unit 471. Go ahead. Nothing. Just the static floor reasserting itself. I tried again. Nothing. I adjusted the squelch, moved the truck to a slightly higher spot on the road, and tried a third time. Dead air. This didn't alarm me. It was exactly what happened in that terrain. A momentary atmospheric bounce could carry a signal over a ridge, and then the window closed. I assumed it was another officer working the same general area. Maybe a DCNR ranger from the Susquehannock Forest District in Cootersport calling into their own dispatch. Our frequencies were different. But bleed over happened, especially with older equipment. The mention of Nelson Branch made sense. It's one of the main drainages in the Hammersley, a stream valley that runs roughly east to west through the middle of the wild area. I logged the reception in my daily field notes and moved on. I didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. The second time was different. Late October, I was working a complaint. The landowner on the eastern side of the wild area had reported hearing rifle shots during archery season, which meant either someone was illegally using a firearm or there was a poaching situation. I'd driven as far as the road allowed, which put me near the trailhead for the Hammersley Trail, where it follows the Hammersley Fork downstream toward Kettle Creek. It was about 4 in the afternoon. Overcast, temperature dropping. The kind of autumn evening where the hollows fill with cold air and the light goes gray an hour before sunset. I was standing outside my truck, glassing the far hillside with binoculars, when I heard the voice again. Not on the radio, in the air, coming from the woods. It was faint, and it was directional, clearly originating from the south, from down in the drainage where the Hammersley Fork runs. A man's voice. Not shouting, not in distress. Speaking at the volume you'd use to call someone who was 100 yards away. Conversational but projected. I couldn't make out specific words, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It was someone talking, pausing, talking again. The way you speak when you expect a reply. My first thought was that it was a hunter calling to a partner. This is common enough, 2 people hunting on opposite sides of a hollow, coordinating at the end of the day. Legal, normal, not my concern, unless they were the ones with the rifle. But I listened for about 2 minutes, and 2 things registered. First, no one answered. The voice spoke, paused, spoke again, paused. Each time the pause was the same length, long enough for a response that never came. Second, and this was the detail that made me write it down, the voice didn't move. It stayed in exactly the same location. Sound carries strangely in those hollows. The Hammersley Fork cuts through a valley that's narrow enough to channel acoustics and deep enough to amplify them, especially in cold air when the temperature inversion layers act like a lid over the drainage. But even accounting for that, a person walking would produce a voice that shifted slightly in bearing, in apparent distance, in the way the terrain colored the sound. This voice was stationary, fixed, like someone standing in one spot and speaking into the trees at regular intervals. I recorded the bearing as best I could, roughly 190 degrees from my position, which put it somewhere along the Nelson Branch or its confluence with the Hammersley Fork, the same drainage that had been mentioned in the radio transmission 3 weeks earlier. I debated walking in. It was a 90-minute hike to the Nelson Branch confluence from where I stood, maybe longer in fading light with the kind of terrain the Hammersley demanded, creek crossings, deadfall, stretches where the trail dissolved into game paths. I had a complaint to work. The voice wasn't calling for help. I made a professional judgment and stayed on task. By the time I finished my patrol and drove back to Cross Fork, it was dark. I wrote up the rifle shot complaint as unsubstantiated. I'd found no evidence of a firearm violation, and in a separate section of my daily log, I noted the voice. I used careful language. Heard what appeared to be a male subject speaking at moderate volume from the approximate vicinity of the Nelson Branch confluence. No words discernible. No distress indicated. Duration approximately 2 minutes. No response from a second party observed. I filed the log and moved on. What changed everything was the phone call I got in mid-November. I was at the regional office in Williamsport for a quarterly equipment check when Sergeant Whelan, my direct supervisor, pulled me aside and asked if I'd logged any unusual radio traffic during archery season. I told him about the squelch break on McConnell Road. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. "Did you hear anything else?" "Not on the radio. In the field." I told him about the voice on the Hammersley Fork drainage. He asked me to describe it. I did the rhythm, the pauses, the fixed location, the lack of a reply. He wrote none of this down. He just listened. When I finished, he asked me how long I'd been assigned to Potter County. 6 years. "You ever hear anything like that before?" "No." He told me to sit down, and then he told me something that reframed every quiet evening I'd ever spent in that drainage. 3 other commission officers had reported hearing the same thing. Not the same incident, the same phenomenon. Over a span of 11 years. The first report was from 2010. An officer named Garrity, who'd held the Potter County territory before me, had logged a nearly identical entry in his daily notes during the fall bear season. Male voice, moderate volume, coming from the Nelson Branch drainage. No words discernible. No distress. No second voice. He'd noted it once and never mentioned it again. But the log survived because the commission digitized all field notes starting in 2008. The second report was from 2014. A DCNR ranger, not a game commission officer, but a ranger from the Susquehannock Forest District, had called the commission's dispatch line to ask whether any of our officers were working the Hammersley that evening. He'd heard a voice from inside the wild area while he was checking a gate on McConnell Road. Dispatch confirmed no commission personnel were in the area. The ranger filed nothing formal on his end, but our dispatcher had logged the inquiry, and Sergeant Whelan had flagged it during a routine review. The third report was from 2019. Another game warden, a temporary officer filling in during a vacancy, heard the voice while hiking the Susquehannock Trail system where it crosses through the Hammersley. He was off duty, backpacking on a personal trip. He hadn't reported it through official channels. He'd mentioned it to a colleague at a training session, and the colleague had mentioned it to Whelan. 4 reports in 11 years from 4 different people, 3 of them trained law enforcement officers, all describing the same thing. A male voice, calm, speaking from the Nelson Branch drainage, in the Hammersley Wild area, pausing as if waiting for a response that never came. All in the fall, all in the late afternoon or evening. None involving discernible words, none involving a second voice. Whelan didn't tell me what to do with this information. He told me what the commission had done, which was nothing. There was no missing persons case associated with the Hammersley that matched this pattern. There was no open investigation. The voice wasn't a crime. It wasn't a violation. It wasn't a complaint. It was 4 notations in 4 different files that no one had connected until Whelan, who had an archivist's instinct, had run a keyword search on the digitized logs and found 3 of them. The 4th, the off-duty backpacker, had come to him by accident. "I'm not asking you to investigate," he said. "I'm telling you what's in the record. You're the officer assigned to that territory, and I think you should know." I asked him the obvious question. Had anyone walked in and looked? He paused long enough that I knew the answer before he gave it. Garrity went in once, spring of 2011, solo. He hiked the Nelson Branch Trail from the western trailhead to the confluence, found nothing. No camps, no structures, no sign of a transient. He wrote it up as unable to locate source of previously reported auditory observation. He retired 2 years later. Did he hear it again? He never reported it again, but he also stopped working the Hammersley after dark. That was November 2021. I spent the winter thinking about it the way you think about anything that sits in the gap between your professional obligations and your personal curiosity. There was nothing actionable. 4 people had heard a voice in the woods. There was no victim, no suspect, no crime, no complaint. The Hammersley was 30,000 acres of roadless forest on a dissected plateau. Sound could carry in impossible ways through those hollows. Temperature inversions, wind channeling, acoustic reflections off cliff faces. Any acoustics engineer could have generated a dozen plausible explanations. But none of those explanations accounted for the consistency. The same drainage, the same time of year, the same vocal quality, the same pattern of speech and pause and speech. Across 11 years and 4 independent witnesses. In March of 2022, I drove to Cootersport and stopped at a diner that the retired officers frequented. I wasn't looking for Garrity specifically, but I knew the community was small enough that asking about him would get me a response. The woman behind the counter told me he'd moved to Wellsboro about 40 minutes east after his retirement. She gave me his phone number without my asking for it. The way people in Potter County share information. Freely. Because privacy is something you enforce through geography, not through caution. I called Garrity that evening. He answered on the second ring. And when I told him I was the current WCO for his old territory, his voice changed. Not unfriendly, but guarded. The way a man sounds when he suspects you're about to ask the question he hoped no one would. I told him I'd heard the voice. I told him exactly what I'd experienced. The bearing, the cadence, the fixed position, the lack of reply. I told him Whelan had shown me the log entries. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to check the call was still connected. I'm going to tell you what I know, he said. And then I'm going to ask you not to call me again. Not because I'm angry, and not because I don't believe you. Because I spent the last 2 years of my career thinking about that sound. And it cost me something I can't name, but I can feel the absence of. You understand? I said I did, though I didn't. Not then? Garrity told me he'd heard the voice 3 times, not once, as his log showed. 3 times across 2 consecutive autumns, 2010 and 2011. The first time was what he'd logged. A single observation during bear season, noted and filed. The second time was 2 weeks later, from a different position on the eastern rim of the drainage. And this time, he'd been close enough to make out individual syllables. He couldn't identify the language. He said that carefully. Not that the words were unclear, that the language was unrecognizable. The syllables were distinct, the pronunciation was deliberate. But they didn't correspond to English or to anything he could place. He spoke some German from his family. It wasn't German. It had a cadence he described as rounded, as though the vowels were more important than the consonants. The third time was during his solo hike into the Nelson Branch in the spring of 2011. The trip he'd written up as unsuccessful. He told me he'd lied in that report. He had found something. Not a person, not a camp, not a structure. He'd followed the Nelson Branch Trail to a point about a mile upstream from the confluence with the Hammersley Fork, in a section where the drainage narrows and the hemlock canopy closes to the point where midday looks like twilight. There was a clearing there. Not a natural meadow, but a blowdown gap where several large trees had come down in a storm, probably years earlier. and the forest hadn't reclaimed the space yet. In the center of this clearing, he found a circle of stones, not a fire ring. He was emphatic about that. The stones were too large, he estimated 40 to 60 pounds each, and they were arranged in a circle roughly 12 feet in diameter, placed with their flattest faces up, like seats or platforms. There were 9 of them. He counted twice. Inside the circle, the ground was bare. Not bare the way a campsite is bare, worn down by foot traffic, bare the way he'd never seen ground be bare in a forest. No leaf litter, no twigs, no seedlings, no moss. Just dark soil, slightly concave, as though the circle were a very shallow bowl. He stood at the edge of this clearing and felt what he described to me, in the plainest language a retired law enforcement officer could manage, as a strong disinclination to go closer. He said the air in the clearing felt different, not warmer, not colder, but thicker, a density he could feel on his face and the backs of his hands. He said it was the same sensation as standing close to a large piece of running machinery, not vibration, exactly, but the awareness that energy was being expended in the space, even though nothing was visibly moving. He left. He hiked out. He wrote a log entry that described finding nothing, and he never went back. And the voice? I asked. I didn't hear it that day, but standing in that clearing, I understood something about it that I can't prove and have never been able to articulate to my own satisfaction. What? That it wasn't calling for help. It was calling to something. And the pauses weren't waiting for a human response. They were waiting for the right person to walk in and complete the call. He asked me not to phone him again, and I honored that. I spent the spring and summer of 2022 carrying what Garrity had given me the way you carry a stone in your coat pocket, always present, never the right time to set it down. I did my job. I worked turkey season, ran fishing enforcement on Kettle Creek, assisted with elk management operations down in the Cameron County herd range. Normal work, professional work. The kind of work that fills a day so completely you can forget that your mind, when idle, always drifts back to the same drainage on the same map. In September, as the leaves started turning and archery season approached, I made a decision. I told dispatch I'd be conducting a backcountry patrol of the Hammersley Wild area, a foot patrol solo, covering the Nelson Branch drainage to check for early season violations and illegal tree stand placement. This was well within my duties. It was legitimate. I filed the route plan, packed my standard field kit, and on an overcast Thursday afternoon in the first week of October, I parked my truck at the western trailhead and hiked in. The Nelson Branch Trail follows an old railroad grade for the first 1.5 miles level, wide enough for a vehicle, carpeted with decades of leaf litter. The Emporium Lumber Company had laid narrow-gauge track along these drainages in the 1890s, pulling out the old-growth hemlock and white pine that had covered the plateau before anyone thought to stop them. The rails and ties were long gone, but the grade remained a flat, straight corridor through second-growth hardwoods that were now tall enough and thick enough to look ancient to anyone who didn't know the history. After the old grade ended, the trail narrowed and began following the creek itself. Nelson Branch in early October was running low and clear, maybe 10 feet wide, with a gravel bottom and pools every 100 yards or so where native brook trout held in the shade. I crossed the stream 4 times in the first half-mile. The crossings were ankle-deep. The water was cold enough to register through my boots. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Not silent, there were birds, the creek, the wind in the canopy, but a quality of quiet that I'd learned, over 6 years in Potter County, to recognize as specific to these deep Allegheny drainages. A compression. The hollow walls rising on either side narrowed the sky to a strip of gray directly overhead, and the canopy hemlock mixed with beech and birch filtered what was left. The sound of my own boots on wet leaves felt overloud. I reached the section Garrity had described the narrowing. The hemlock canopy closing overhead at about 3:30 in the afternoon. The light was already failing in the way it does in these drainages, where the sun angle in early October drops below the rim of the hollow by mid-afternoon, and everything goes to a flat, directionless gray. I found the clearing. It was exactly where he'd said it would be, about a mile upstream from the confluence. The blowdown gap was still open, though some of the fallen trunks had started decomposing into soft mounds that new ferns were colonizing. The circle of stones was there. I stopped at the edge and counted. 9 stones, large, flat-topped, arranged in a rough circle approximately 12 feet across. Inside the circle, the ground was bare. Garrity had seen this 11 years ago. 11 years of leaf fall, of wind, of the slow organic accumulation that covers everything in a Pennsylvania forest within a single season. The ground inside the circle should have been buried under a foot of debris. It was clean, dark soil, slightly concave. No leaves, no twigs, no seedlings, not even a single hemlock needle, despite the fact that hemlocks hung directly over the circle and were visibly shedding onto every surface within 50 feet. I stood there for a while. I did not enter the circle. This was not because of Garrity's warning or his description of the air. It was because I'm a law enforcement officer, and the circle looked like evidence of something I couldn't yet categorize. And you don't contaminate evidence by walking through it. That's what I told myself. That's what I wrote in my notes. The air did feel different. I'll say that plainly. There was a density to it, centered on the clearing, that thinned as I stepped back and thickened as I leaned forward. It wasn't temperature. It wasn't humidity. It was something my skin registered that I had no professional vocabulary to describe. The closest comparison I can make is the feeling of standing near a waterfall, not the mist, not the sound, but the pressure, a displacement. I photographed the circle from 4 angles. I took GPS coordinates. I measured the diameter by pacing the outside edge, 11 feet 8 inches, roughly. I noted the species of the stones, which appeared to be local sandstone, consistent with the exposed outcrops on the hollow walls. I did not touch them. I documented everything the way I'd document a crime scene, because it was the only protocol I had. Then I sat down on a log at the edge of the clearing and waited. The light continued to fail. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath by 4:15. The forest around me settled into its evening mode, bird calls shifting from territorial songs to contact notes. The creek sound seeming louder as the wind died. A barred owl beginning its warm-up somewhere to the east. I was comfortable. I was equipped. I had a headlamp and a GPS unit and a sidearm, and roughly 90 minutes of hiking between me and my truck, which I could do in the dark if I had to, because I'd done it before. At 4:37, I know the time. Because I looked at my watch immediately, I heard the voice. It came from the south, downstream, toward the confluence, the same direction I'd noted 6 months earlier from the drainage rim. But I was inside the hollow now, less than a mile from the confluence itself. And the difference in proximity was staggering. From the rim, the voice had been faint, an impression of speech more than speech itself. From where I sat, it was clear. Not loud and not close, but clear the way a voice across a still lake is clear, hurrying intact over distance, because there was nothing between the source and my ears but cold, dense air lying in the bottom of the drainage like water in a trough. A man's voice, measured, unhurried. speaking in phrases of 4 to 7 seconds, then pausing for exactly the same interval. I timed 3 cycles with my watch before I trusted the consistency, then speaking again. The syllables were distinct enough that I knew they were deliberate, shaped, intentional. But Garrity had been right. They weren't English. They weren't anything I recognized. The vowels dominated, open and rounded, and the consonants seemed to serve as bridges between them rather than carrying meaning on their own. It sounded, and I recognize how useless this comparison is, like someone reciting a liturgy in a language designed to be spoken outdoors. I need to be precise about what I did next, because it matters for what came later. I stood up. I oriented myself toward the sound. I took a compass bearing, 178 degrees, almost due south. I estimated the distance at 300 to 400 yards based on the apparent volume and the way the hollow walls would channel sound. And then I made a conscious decision that I've examined from every angle in the years since and have never been able to fully justify or fully regret. I did not walk toward it. I'm a game warden. I was armed. I was trained. I was in my own territory. If a man was standing in those woods 300 yards from me, speaking in the last light of an October afternoon, I had every professional reason to walk over and make contact. License check, welfare check, simple human curiosity. Any of those would have been sufficient. But Garrity's words were in my head. The right person to walk in and complete the call. And something in the way the voice carried, the absolute regularity of those intervals, the way it stayed rooted to a single point in space, without the slightest drift or variation, told me that walking toward it was exactly what it was structured to produce. The call was not random. The pattern was not conversational. It was rhythmic, iterative, designed to pull attention, then feet, then a body, toward its source. I sat back down on the log. I continued timing the intervals. I began writing in my field notebook, documenting everything: the bearing, the estimated distance, the cadence, the duration of each phrase, the duration of each pause. I wrote down the syllables as best I could approximate them phonetically, which was poor. My handwriting was shaking slightly, not from cold, and the sounds didn't map well to English phonetics. The voice continued for 11 minutes. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. Mid-phrase, or at least what sounded like mid-phrase. The rhythm that had been metronomic broke on what felt like an incomplete beat, and the drainage returned to the ordinary sounds of a forest at dusk. I waited another 20 minutes. Nothing. The barred owl had gone quiet. I turned on my headlamp, packed my notebook, and hiked out. The crossings were harder in the dark, the water felt colder, the rocks more unstable, but I made the trailhead by 6:40 and drove back to Cootersport with the heater running full. That night, at my kitchen table, I did something I'd never done in 6 years of field work. I wrote 2 versions of my daily log. The first was the official entry, filed digitally. Conducted foot patrol, Nelson Branch drainage, Hammersley Wild area. No violations observed, no contacts made. Returned to vehicle at approximately 1840. Every word true. The second version I wrote on a legal pad and kept in my home. It was 4 pages long. It included everything: the clearing, the stones, the bare ground, the GPS coordinates, the voice, the bearing, the cadence, the approximate phonetic transcription, the 11-minute duration, the abrupt cessation. I signed it and dated it. I don't know why I signed it. It felt like something that needed to exist as testimony rather than as notes. I told no one. Not Whelan, not dispatch, not my wife. The official log was clean, the personal record was hidden in my desk drawer, and the next morning, I went back to work checking licenses on Kettle Creek like nothing had happened. This is the part of the story where I need to slow down, because the next 3 months are where the shape of the thing became visible. And I need you to see it the way I saw it, gradually, reluctantly, with every rational objection I could muster being answered and then replaced by a larger one. In late October, I was working a deer poaching case on the eastern side of the wild area. Not inside the Hammersley itself, but on state game lands that bordered it, SGL 64, a parcel of managed forest east of Cross Fork. The case involved a landowner whose neighbor had reported hearing shots at night, which in that area meant spotlighting hunting deer with a light from a vehicle, which is both illegal and, in Potter County, taken personally. I was doing the tedious part of the investigation, driving back roads after dark, looking for tire tracks, fresh gut piles, anything that confirmed a pattern. Around 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, I was parked on a gated forest road with my lights off and my window down, listening. Standard enforcement technique. Spotlighters give themselves away with engine noise and light sweeps. And a clear October night in Potter County is quiet enough to hear a truck from a mile away. I heard the voice. Not from the Hammersley, not from the south, from the northeast, from a ridge above the game land. At a distance I estimated it 1/2 mile or more. The same cadence, the same phrasing, the same rounded vowels and subordinate consonants, the same pattern of speak and pause and speak, with the pause lasting exactly as long as each phrase. My hands went cold, not from temperature, from the recognition. I was 7 miles northeast of the Nelson Branch drainage, across a plateau summit and an entire watershed. And the voice was here, not the same acoustic event bouncing through valleys. I was in a different drainage entirely, with a major ridgeline between me and the Hammersley. This was either a second source or the same source in a different location. I sat in my truck for the full duration. I timed it again. 9 minutes this time. The same abrupt cessation, a broken rhythm, an incomplete phrase, and then silence. I wrote it all down on a gas station receipt because my notebook was in my field kit in the back seat, and I did not want to take my attention off the bearing long enough to retrieve it. 112 degrees. Northeast. Estimated distance 600 to 800 yards. Duration 9 minutes. Cadence identical to the October 7th observation. I drove home and added the receipt to the legal pad in my desk. November passed. Rifle season came and went. I worked 12-hour days checking deer on game lands, breaking up trespassing disputes, filing harvest reports. Normal, consuming. There was no room in November for the voice, and the voice didn't come. I listened for it every time I was out after dark, and the woods gave me nothing but the usual owls, coyotes, the occasional car on a distant road. Potter County in November sounds exactly like Potter County is supposed to sound. December was when the hunter came in. I should say more about how this worked operationally. The commission maintained a network of voluntary contact with the hunting public. Hunters who spent significant time on state forest land, the serious ones, the ones with decades of experience in a specific area, would sometimes stop by the district office or flag me down on a road to share information. Trail camera photos of poaching activity, reports of illegal dumps, observations about wildlife behavior that might be relevant to management. It was informal, but it was valuable. These men and women knew the land in ways that my 6 years couldn't match. Some of them had hunted the same hollows for 30 or 40 years. A man I'll call Dale. I'm using a different name because he's still alive and never gave me permission to share. This came to my truck one afternoon in mid-December, while I was parked at a check station on Route 144 south of Cherry Springs. Dale was in his late 60s. He'd hunted the Hammersley drainage since the 1980s. He was a careful man, a retired surveyor, precise in his language and not given to speculation. He wanted to tell me about something he'd heard during rifle season. I expected a poaching report. Instead, he told me he'd been sitting in a ground blind on the southern rim of the Nelson Branch drainage, about a half-mile upstream from where the Susquehannock Trail crossed, when he'd heard a man's voice speaking from inside the hollow. Late afternoon. No wind, clear air. He'd listened for what he estimated was 5 to 6 minutes before the voice stopped. I figured it was a hunter talking on a cell phone, he said. Except there's no cell service down there. And it didn't stop the way a phone conversation stops. It just quit, like someone turned off a recording. I kept my face neutral. Could you make out what he was saying? No, but it wasn't English. He said this with the same flat certainty that Garrity had used. Not guessing, stating. I've heard Spanish on job sites for 30 years. It wasn't Spanish. It wasn't French. It wasn't anything with a shape I recognized. The sounds were round. I don't know how else to say it. Round. Garrity had said rounded. Two men, 11 years apart, using the same word to describe the same vocal quality in the same drainage. I asked Dale if he'd ever heard it before. He had, twice, once in 2016, once in 2019, both times in the fall, both times late afternoon, both times from the Nelson Branch drainage. He'd never mentioned it to anyone, because in here he gave me a look that was both sheepish and defiant. You tell people you heard voices in the woods, and they hear something different than what you said. I understood him perfectly. I asked if he'd ever gone to look. He shook his head. I'm a hunter, not a detective. And whatever's down there, it's been down there a long time. If it wanted to be found, it would have come up to the rim. I thanked him and made careful notes after he left. I now had 7 reports. Garrity's 3, 2010 to 2011. The DCNR Rangers 1, 2014. The Temporary Wardens 1, 2019. My 2, 2021. And Dale's 3, 2016, 2019, 2021. His rifle season observation overlapped temporally with my archery season 1. 10 distinct events across 12 years, if I counted each individually. 7 independent witnesses if I included myself. All describing the same phenomenon. All in the fall. All in the late afternoon or evening. All from or near the Nelson Branch drainage, with the single exception of my off-axis reception from the game. Land 7 miles northeast. 10 events were not 4. 10 events were a pattern. And the pattern had characteristics that I couldn't explain through acoustics, through transients, through lost hunters, or through any of the mundane categories I'd been trying to force it into. The voice occurred seasonally, fall only, September through November, coinciding with the period when temperature inversions were strongest in the drainages. This was the single best natural explanation. A sound source somewhere in the hollow, a water feature, a wind formation, something mechanical in the terrain being amplified and shaped by cold air pooling until it resembled human speech. I wanted this to be the answer. I spent a weekend reading about acoustic phenomena in mountain valleys, infrasound generation by wind over terrain features, even the literature on musical roads, where tire noise on specific surfaces produces tonal patterns. None of it accounted for the consistency of the perceived language-like structure. Random acoustic shaping doesn't produce recognizable syllables that multiple listeners describe the same way. The voice occurred in the late afternoon and evening, coinciding with the daily temperature inversion cycle, when cold air begins sinking into the hollows. This supported the acoustic explanation. It also coincided with the period of maximum psychological vulnerability for a solo observer: fading light, cooling air, the liminal transition between day and night. I noted this honestly. I was aware that perception is shaped by expectation, and that I had gone into the drainage in October already expecting to hear something. But Dale had not. The 2014 DCNR Ranger had not. The pattern's consistency across prepared and unprepared listeners argued against pure perceptual construction. And then there was the clearing. The 9 stones. The bare ground that defied 11 years of forest succession. That wasn't acoustic, that wasn't perceptual. That was physical, photographable, measurable. And I had the GPS coordinates and the images to prove it. In January 2022, January 2023 by now, I'm getting turned around. The October trip into the drainage was 2022, so this is early 2023. In January 2023, during the dead time between hunting seasons when my workload dropped to its annual minimum, I did something I'd been circling for months. I went to the Susquehannock Forest District office in Coudersport and asked to see their historical records for the Hammersley Wild area. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I told the clerk I was researching old logging features for a commission report on historical land use, which was plausible enough that she didn't ask questions. She gave me access to a filing cabinet of old planning documents, timber sale records, and trail maintenance logs dating back to the 1970s. I spent 4 hours in that office. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect: boundary surveys, salvage sale appraisals, bridge inspection reports. But in a folder labeled MISC Nelson Branch, I found a document that stopped me cold. It was a single-page typed memo, dated April 19, 1987, from the district forester to the regional office in Emporium. The subject line read, "Recommendation, Trail Relocation Nelson Branch Section, Susquehannock Trail System." The memo recommended rerouting a half-mile section of the Susquehannock Trail away from its existing path along Nelson Branch and onto a higher contour on the western valley wall. The stated reason was persistent erosion and seasonal flooding, rendering the existing trail alignment unsuitable for maintained trail standards. This was unremarkable. Trail relocations happen constantly in Pennsylvania state forests. What was remarkable was a handwritten annotation in the margin, in a different ink and a different hand. It read, "Also the clearing, flagged by J. Molina 4/86. Still active. Reroute keeps traffic above it." I read that annotation 4 times. I copied it word for word into my notebook. Still active. Not still present. Still active. As though the clearing were doing something. As though it had been flagged by someone named J. Molina in April 1986. A full year before the memo, because it was observed doing something that warranted a trail relocation to keep hikers away from it. I asked the clerk if the name J. Molina appeared in any employment records. She checked and found that a Jorge Molina had been a seasonal forestry technician with the Susquehannock Forest District from 1984 to 1989. No current contact information, no forwarding address. The trail had been rerouted. I'd hiked the current route in October without knowing that the original trail had once passed directly through or adjacent to the clearing I'd found. The 1987 relocation had moved the maintained path to higher ground. Anyone hiking the Susquehannock Trail system today would pass a quarter mile above the clearing and never know it was there unless they left the trail and descended into the drainage bottom. Which is exactly what Garrity had done in 2011. Which is exactly what I had done in October 2022. The clearing had been known since at least 1986. It had been described as active in 1986. The institution's response had been to move the trail away from it and say nothing. I left the district office with a photocopy of the memo. The clerk let me use the machine without reviewing what I copied and drove home through a snowstorm on Route 6, thinking about the word active and what a forestry technician in 1986 might have seen that prompted him to flag a clearing in a remote drainage for special attention. That night, I spread everything on my kitchen table. The legal pad, the gas station receipt, the photographs, the GPS coordinates, the memo, the log entries Whelan had shared with me. I arranged them chronologically and looked at the timeline. 1986, forestry technician J. Molina flags the clearing on Nelson Branch as active. 1987, trail rerouted to avoid the clearing. No formal explanation beyond erosion. 2010 to 2011, Game Warden Garrity hears the voice 3 times, finds the clearing, reports finding nothing. 2014, DCN, our ranger hears the voice from McConnell Road. 2016, civilian hunter Dale hears the voice. 2019, temporary warden and Dale both hear the voice in the same season. 2021, I hear the voice twice, once on radio, once in the field. Dale hears it during rifle season. 2022, I enter the drainage and find the clearing unchanged after 11 years. I hear the voice for 11 minutes from approximately 300 yards south of the clearing. 36 years, at minimum. The clearing had been there and active for 36 years. The voice had been documented for 12. And the institutional response from both the Game Commission and DCNR had been to note it, reroute around it, and keep quiet. I should have stopped here. I had a file. I had a timeline. I had enough to write an internal memo to Whelan and recommend what? A formal investigation of a clearing in the woods and an intermittent sound that might be an acoustic phenomenon. The commission would have thanked me, filed it, and done nothing, because nothing actionable existed. There was no victim, no crime, no threat. Just a place in the forest that had been doing something for at least 36 years that nobody wanted to examine directly. But I couldn't stop. And the reason I couldn't stop arrived in March 2023 in the form of a phone call from a county 911 dispatcher named Brenda, who worked the overnight shift in Cootersport. Brenda called me at 7 in the morning early for her, given her shift, and asked if I was the warden who works the Hammersley area. I confirmed. She told me she'd taken a call the previous night, around 2 a.m., from a man on a satellite messenger device. The device had an SOS function that connected to a monitoring center, which had relayed the call to local 911. The man said he was backpacking on the Susquehannock Trail in the Hammersley Wild area and needed assistance. Not medical. Not an injury. He said someone had been outside his tent for the past hour, talking, and would not respond when he called back to them. And he wanted a warden or a ranger to come in and check on the situation. Brenda had dispatched a DCNR ranger, who reached the trailhead at dawn and hiked in. The backpacker was found at his campsite on the Hammersley Fork, approximately 2 miles downstream from the Nelson Branch confluence. He was unharmed. He was calm. He was a 41-year-old schoolteacher from Harrisburg on a solo trip. He told the ranger that beginning at approximately 1 a.m., he'd heard a man's voice speaking outside his tent at what he estimated was a distance of 50 to 100 feet. The voice spoke in phrases of several seconds, paused, and spoke again. He'd unzipped his tent and called out twice. The voice did not respond, did not pause, did not change in any way. He'd used his headlamp to scan the area around his campsite and seen nothing. No reflective eyes, no silhouette, no footprints in the morning when the ranger checked. The voice had continued for approximately 45 minutes, then stopped. The ranger wrote it up as possible wildlife vocalization misidentified by inexperienced backcountry user, and closed the report. Brenda called me because the backpacker had said something to the 911 relay that wasn't in the ranger's report. When describing the voice, he'd told the operator, "It's not English. I don't think it's any language I've ever heard. The sounds are very round." Round. I asked Brenda to send me the 911 call log. She did, unofficially, as a personal favor. I printed it and added it to the file on my kitchen table. 8 witnesses now. 11 years of Game Commission reports, plus a DCNR relocation memo referencing observations going back to 1986. A 37-year minimum span. And a new data point that broke the established pattern in a way I hadn't anticipated. The backpacker heard the voice at 1 a.m., not late afternoon, not evening, the middle of the night, in March, not fall, 2 miles downstream from the clearing, not at it. The pattern was either more complex than I'd assumed or it was changing. I spent April and May preparing. I want to be honest about what I was preparing for because the honesty matters. I was not preparing a formal investigation. The commission had no open case. I had no supervisor's authorization. What I was doing was planning a multi-day solo backcountry trip into the Hammersley Wild area, on my own time, as a private citizen who happened to be a game warden with a professional reason to be familiar with the terrain. I would carry my service radio, but no authority. I would document what I found, but file nothing. I was, in every way that mattered, conducting an unauthorized investigation of a phenomenon my employer had spent 37 years choosing not to investigate. And the only justification I had was the file on my kitchen table and the knowledge that no one else was going to do it. I told my wife I was doing a shakedown backpacking trip to test new gear before fall patrol season. She didn't believe me. She'd been married to me long enough to know when I was carrying something I wouldn't name, but she didn't press. That restraint was a kindness I didn't deserve. And I'm aware that the decision I made in May put a weight on my marriage that I've never fully removed. I hiked in on a Thursday in the 3rd week of May. The plan was 3 nights. I entered from the western trailhead on Nelson Branch, the same route I'd taken in October. But this time, I was carrying a full-packed tent, sleeping bag, 3 days of food, water filter, headlamp, 2 sets of spare batteries, my field notebook, a handheld GPS, and a compact digital audio recorder I'd purchased with my own money from an electronics store in Wellsboro. The recorder was the key variable. Every prior witness, including me, had described the voice from memory. Memory is unreliable. Memory is shapeable. If the voice was an acoustic phenomenon, wind, water, resonance, a recorder would capture the waveform and I could have it analyzed. If the voice was perceptual, some trick of expectation and isolation working on prepared listeners, the recorder would capture silence, and I would have my answer that way too. Either outcome was acceptable. Either outcome would let me close the file. I set up my camp 200 yards north of the clearing, on a flat bench above the creek where a few old hemlock stumps suggested a logging camp had once stood. Close enough to hear anything that happened at the clearing. Far enough that I wasn't sleeping inside it. I arrived at mid-afternoon and spent the remaining daylight hours doing what any experienced backcountry traveler does: filtering water, organizing my site, hanging my food bag, walking the perimeter to familiarize myself with the terrain in case I needed to move in the dark. I visited the clearing before sunset. It was unchanged. The 9 stones, the bare ground, the shallow concavity, no new growth, no leaf accumulation. May, in a Pennsylvania forest, is an explosion of green fiddlehead ferns, trillium, jack-in-the-pulpit, maple seedlings erupting from every square inch of available soil. The forest floor around the clearing was carpeted in emerging growth. The ground inside the circle was as bare as it had been in October, as bare as it had presumably been in 1986 when Molina flagged it. I placed the audio recorder on a flat stone at the northern edge of the clearing, oriented the microphone toward the south, the direction the voice had consistently come from, and turned it on. The recorder had a 60-hour battery life and a 32-gigabyte card. I could let it run continuously for the entire trip and still have capacity to spare. Then I went back to my camp and waited. The first night, I heard nothing. I lay in my tent from dark until roughly midnight, awake, listening. The drainage produced its ordinary symphony, creek water over stones, a light wind in the upper canopy, the occasional rustle of a small mammal in the leaf litter. Once, around 10:30, a barred owl called from somewhere upstream, and another answered from across the hollow, and they went back and forth for several minutes in a pattern that was rhythmic and antiphonal and utterly, comfortingly natural. No voice, no anomaly. The forest sounded like a forest. I slept fitfully and woke at dawn. I retrieved the recorder, played back a compressed scan of the overnight audio, and heard nothing except what I'd heard with my own ears: creek, wind, owls, the barely audible hiss of the recorder's own noise floor. I replaced the recorder and spent the day hiking the drainage in both directions, north and south of the clearing, looking for anything that might serve as a physical explanation. A culvert, a mine opening, a cliff face with the right geometry to act as a parabolic reflector, a water feature that might produce tonal sound under specific flow conditions. I found nothing. The drainage was geologically unremarkable. Sandstone walls, shale ledges, the creek cutting through soft alluvial deposits laid down over centuries. No caves, no mine shafts. The Hammersley had never been mined. The Emporium Lumber Company had held mineral rights but never exercised them. And the subsurface rights had been formally acquired by the state in 2004. I checked the exposed rock faces for any feature that might channel or amplify sound. There were small overhangs, shallow recesses, the kind of minor concavities you'd find in any dissected sandstone plateau. Nothing capable of producing the phenomenon I'd heard. I did find one thing. About 3/4 of a mile south of the clearing, downstream along Nelson Branch toward its confluence with the Hammersley Fork, I came across a section of creek bank that had recently slumped. A chunk of the bank, maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, had calved off and fallen into the stream. This happens constantly in these drainages. The creeks erode their banks in spring. The banks fail. The creek adjusts. Normal hydrology. But the exposed cross-section of the bank showed something I hadn't seen before. The soil profile was typical for the first 18 inches, a layer of dark organic topsoil over a lighter layer of mineral soil over a yellow-gray clay subsoil. Below the clay, however, there was a stratum about 3 inches thick that was a deep, uniform black. Not dark brown, not organic black like topsoil, a mineral black, with a faintly vitreous quality, glassy, like obsidian, though it clearly wasn't obsidian. It looked like the soil at that depth had been subjected to intense heat. I'd seen something similar once before, on a prescribed burn site where a large brush pile had been ignited and the sustained heat had vitrified the clay beneath it. But that process required temperatures of over 1,000 degrees maintained for hours, and it produced a shallow, irregular lens of fused soil. This stratum was 3 inches thick and extended uniformly along the entire exposed face of the bank slump, 4 feet that I could see, continuing in both directions under the intact bank. I photographed it. I took a soil sample in a plastic bag. I marked the GPS coordinates. That night, the second night, I set the recorder running again and returned to my tent. The weather had changed. A warm front was pushing through, and the temperature at dusk was at least 15 degrees warmer than the previous evening. The sky was overcast. The air was humid and still. No wind. The drainage was so quiet that I could hear the creek as a continuous texture rather than individual sounds, a white noise curtain that filled the hollow from wall to wall. At 11:17 p.m., I was awake. I was watching the time. I had my notebook open on my chest, the voice began. It came from the south. Same bearing, same distance, same cadence. I lay still in my tent with the vestibule unzipped and listened. The phrases and pauses were there, metronomic. But this time, I was closer. My camp was farther south than my October listening position had been, and the air was warm and still, and there was no wind noise to compete. The voice was clearer than I'd ever heard it. I'm going to try to describe what it sounded like, knowing I'll fail. The pitch was a low male register, not bass but baritone. The timbre was resonant, as though the speaker had a deep chest and was projecting without strain. The syllables were predominantly vowel sounds, open, sustained, with what I can only describe as a tonal quality, as though the pitch of the voice carried information the way it does in Mandarin or Vietnamese, but smoother, without the sharp tonal shifts. The consonants were soft, no hard stops, no fricatives, nothing percussive. The effect was of a continuous shaped exhalation that rose and fell within a narrow melodic range. And the pauses were not empty. I had always perceived them as silence, the voice stopping and the forest reasserting itself. But from this distance, in this stillness, I could hear that during each pause there was a very faint, very low sound. There was not the creek, not the wind, not any animal I could identify. It was more felt than heard, a vibration at the lower edge of my perceptual range, somewhere in the chest rather than the ears. It filled each pause uniformly and ceased the instant the voice resumed, as though the voice and the vibration were two parts of the same signal, alternating. I lay still. I timed the event. 14 minutes, the longest I'd recorded. It ended the same way, an incomplete phrase, a rhythmic break, and then nothing. The low vibration cut off simultaneously. I did not sleep. I lay in my tent until dawn, listening to nothing except the creek, and then I retrieved the recorder. This is the part I've replayed more times than I should admit. The recorder had captured the voice. It was faint on the recording. The microphone was designed for dictation, not field recording, and the source was hundreds of yards away. But it was there. A rhythmic pattern of sound and silence, exactly matching my noted timestamps. I could hear the vowel-heavy syllables. I could hear the pauses. What I could not hear on the recording was the low vibration that I had clearly perceived during each pause. On the playback, the pauses were empty. Creek sound, ambient noise floor, nothing else. I played the relevant section 6 times with the recorder held against my ear. The voice was there. The vibration was not. Either the vibration was below the recorder's frequency response, which was possible. The spec sheet listed a low-end cutoff of 80 Hz, and what I'd felt seemed lower than that. Infrasonic, or I had perceived something that wasn't there. Both possibilities unsettled me. If the vibration was infrasonic and real, then there was a physical source generating subaudible energy in synchrony with the voice. which meant either the voice and the vibration were produced by the same mechanism or two different mechanisms were operating in coordination. If the vibration was not real, if I had generated it internally, through expectation, through the physiological response to isolation and darkness and sustained attention, then my perception was compromised. And every observation I'd made in that drainage was suspect. I broke camp that morning, a day earlier than planned. Not because I was frightened, because I had what I'd come for. I had a recording. I had physical evidence, the soil sample, the photographs of the vitrified stratum. I had 2 nights of timestamps and observations. I hiked out and drove to Cootersport and sat in my truck in the parking lot of the Turkey Hill convenience store for 20 minutes, drinking bad coffee and watching normal people buy gas before I trusted myself to go home. Over the next 2 months, I tried to do the right thing with what I had. I sent the soil sample to a friend of a friend, a geologist at Mansfield University, introduced through a chain of acquaintances long enough that the request seemed casual rather than urgent. I told him I'd found an unusual soil stratum in a creek bank in Potter County and wanted to know what it was. He ran a basic analysis and called me back 2 weeks later. The black stratum, he said, was thermally altered clay. Consistent with sustained exposure to high temperature, his estimate was between 900 and 1200 degrees Celsius. The vitrification was uniform, which he said was unusual. In his experience, thermal alteration from surface fires or burn piles produced irregular, patchy vitrification because the heat source was uneven. This sample looked more like kiln-fired material, even exposure from all directions, except it was in situ, meaning it hadn't been moved. Whatever heated it had heated it in place, underground, uniformly, at a depth of roughly 20 inches. I asked him what could do that naturally. He gave me 3 possibilities. A lightning strike channeling through wet soil, which could produce fulgurites and thermal alteration, but not over a 4-foot lateral extent. A buried coal seam fire, which was common in Pennsylvania, but only in areas with coal deposits, and the Hammersleys sat on Devonian sandstone and shale with no coal measures, or a volcanic intrusion, which was geologically impossible in that setting. So what is it? I asked. It's thermally altered clay, he said. That's what I can tell you from the sample. How it got that way, I'd need to see the site. I did not take him to the site. I thanked him and added his report in email. Informal, 2 paragraphs to the file. The recording I kept to myself. I played it for no one. I told myself this was because the quality was poor and the voice was faint, and playing it for someone without context would sound like Nothing Creek noise, with maybe a pattern buried in it if you were primed to listen. This was partially true, but the deeper reason was that the recording was mine. It was the one piece of evidence that confirmed I was not deluded, not pattern matching, not hearing a stream and calling it a voice. It existed. It was on the card. And as long as I kept it, no one could tell me it was anything other than what it was. In August 2023, I requested a meeting with Sergeant Whelan. I told him everything. I showed him the timeline. I played him the recording. I showed him the photographs of the clearing, the soil analysis, the 1987 memo with the handwritten annotation. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything patiently, without interruption, with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in an agency that runs on documented evidence and has developed a genuine respect for the gap between what you know and what you can prove. When I finished, he asked me one question. What do you want the commission to do? I didn't have an answer. That was the problem, and he knew it. There was no crime, no victim, no missing person, no public safety threat that I could articulate. A clearing with bare ground and stones. A voice that spoke in a language no one could identify. A soil anomaly at a depth of 20 inches. None of these things fell within the Game Commission's mandate. None of them fell within anyone's mandate. I want it in the record, I said. I want someone besides me to know the complete picture. Whelan nodded. He told me he would note our meeting in his supervisory log, but that he could not open a formal investigation based on what I'd shown him. He told me I'd done good work, careful, documented, methodical, and that the work would persist in my personal file, and in his memory even if it persisted nowhere else. He told me, gently, that I should consider whether continued involvement with the site was compatible with my professional responsibilities and my personal health. I heard what he was really saying. He was saying what Garrity had said. This will cost you something you can't name. I didn't listen. Not fully. Because by September 2023, when the leaves started turning and the drainage began its annual temperature inversion cycle, I knew I was going back. Not because I expected to solve anything. Not because I believed one more trip would produce the missing piece that made the whole picture resolve into something I could file and close. I was going back because the voice came every fall, and I was the only person in the world who was listening for it. And there was a question I hadn't been able to formulate until I'd sat with the recording and the soil analysis and the timeline for months. A question that only proximity could answer. Not what is it? Not where does it come from? Not what language is it speaking? The question was, why does it pause? Every witness, every single one, across 37 years of observations, described the same structure. Speak, pause, speak, pause. The pauses were consistent. They were the same length as the phrases. They were not the pauses of a monologue. They were the pauses of a dialogue in which one side was silent. Garrity had told me the pauses weren't waiting for a human response. They were waiting for the right person to walk in and complete the call. I had always assumed this was metaphor, something Garrity felt, not something he meant literally. But the pattern, the metronomic alternation, the speak-then-wait structure, the phrase lengths that exactly matched the pause lengths as though they were leaving room. The pattern wasn't metaphorical. It was structural. The voice was formatted as half of a conversation. The other half was missing. I went back in the second week of October 2023. I brought the recorder. I brought a better microphone, a shotgun mic borrowed from a birder in Wellsboro. I brought a second device, a smartphone in airplane mode, with a spectrum analysis app that a colleague in the regional office used for checking radio interference. Its microphone could register frequencies down to roughly 20 hertz. Low enough, maybe, to capture whatever I'd felt during the pauses. I'm going to compress what happened over the next 3 days, because most of it was waiting. And waiting doesn't make for useful narration. I camped in the same spot. I set the recorder and the phone running each evening. I sat. I listened. The first 2 nights, nothing. The third night, October 14th, the voice came. It came later than any prior observation, well after dark, at 9:43 p.m. I was sitting on a log at the edge of my camp, facing south, with the recorder running and the phone in a waterproof bag at my feet. The voice began with the same abruptness I'd learned to expect, no fade-in, no wind-up, just suddenly there, mid-phrase, as though I'd tuned into a broadcast that had been running before I arrived. I listened. I timed. The cadence was identical to every prior event. Speak for 5 to 6 seconds. Pause for 5 to 6 seconds. Repeat. And then I did the thing I'd come to do. During the 4th pause, I spoke. I said clearly, at a conversational volume projected toward the south. "Hello, can you hear me?" The voice resumed on schedule as though I hadn't spoken. The same phrase, the same cadence. No change. I waited for the next pause. I spoke again, louder. "This is a game warden. Can you tell me your location?" The voice resumed again, unchanged. I tried 4 more times, varying my volume, my phrasing, my timing. I tried speaking during the voice, overlapping it. I tried matching its cadence, fitting my words into the pauses the way you'd slot into a conversation. Nothing I did produced any change. The voice was indifferent to my presence, my words, my existence. The event lasted 12 minutes and ended with the same incomplete phrase and simultaneous cutoff. I checked the phone immediately. The spectrum analyzer had recorded the entire event. And there, below the visible waveform of the voice, filling every pause like mortar between bricks, was a low-frequency signal between 14 and 22 hertz. Infrasonic, below human hearing, present during every pause, absent during every phrase, exactly as I had perceived it. The voice was there. The infrasound was there. They alternated with mechanical precision, and nothing I said had any effect on either one. I hiked out the next morning and drove home, and put the phone and the recorder in my desk drawer, next to the legal pad and the soil analysis and the photographs and the 1987 memo. And I sat in my kitchen and understood, finally, what Garrity and Whelan had both been trying to tell me. The voice was not calling for me. It was not calling for anyone who would answer in a human language, at a human frequency, from the outside of whatever process it was part of. My words fell into those pauses and disappeared. The infrasound filled them instead. The conversation was already complete. It had been complete for decades, maybe longer. The voice and the subaudible response were 2 halves of something that didn't need a third participant and never had. The pauses weren't an invitation. They were the other speaker. I still have the file. All of it. The legal pad, the recordings, the soil analysis, the photographs, the spectrum data, the 1987 memo. I haven't been back to the clearing since October 2023. I work my territory. I check licenses. I run enforcement. I drive past the McConnell Road gate every week during hunting season, and I don't stop, and I don't listen, and I keep my windows up and the radio on. But here is the thing I can't put in the file. The thing that has no evidence and no timestamp and no corroboration. The thing I have told no one until now. On the drive home from that last trip, on Route 6 between Cootersport and Wellsboro, at 11:30 at night, with the road empty and the forest pressing dark against both shoulders, I felt it. The low vibration, not from the south, not from any direction, in the truck, in my chest, 14 to 22 hertz of something I couldn't hear but couldn't stop feeling, lasting exactly 5 to 6 seconds, then stopping, then returning. The pattern of the pauses, as if the other half of the conversation had followed me home and was still talking and was not waiting for a reply, because it had never been waiting for a reply. And the thing I'd mistaken for an invitation was just the sound of something breathing in a rhythm so old and so patient that my presence, anyone's presence, was neither required nor refused. Just irrelevant. The same way the forest was irrelevant. The same way the stones and the bare ground and the 37 years of careful silence were irrelevant. It was having its conversation. It had always been having its conversation. And the fact that we could hear one half of it and feel the other half of it and never understand either was not a mystery we were meant to solve. It was a boundary we were meant to recognize. I recognized it. I came home. I closed the desk drawer. The voice is still there. I know this because Dale called me in November, casual as a weather report. and said he'd heard it again from his stand on the rim. Same voice, same cadence, same drainage. Still at it, he said. Still at it, I said. I had nothing else to offer, and neither did he, and the line went quiet, and we hung up. And the Hammersleys stayed where it was, deep in the plateau, doing what it has been doing since before we were listening, and what it will continue to do, I am now certain, long after we stop.